Mount Hood stands as a sentinel over the Oregon landscape. From a distance, it is a picturesque snow-capped cone, the kind of mountain that appears on postcards and license plates. It is technically a dormant volcano, rising over 11,000 feet into the atmosphere. Because of its accessibility and its proximity to Portland, it is one of the most climbed peaks in the world. It lures people in with a false sense of security. It is often described as a walk-up, implying that anyone with a good pair of boots and determination can reach the summit. But the mountain creates its own weather, and the geography of the peak acts as a funnel for storms coming off the Pacific. It is a place where the temperature can drop 40 degrees in a matter of minutes, transforming a spring hike into a fight for survival. In May of 1986, this deception would lead to one of the worst climbing disasters in American history. While the prompt mentions 1990, the event that haunts the history of Mount Hood, the one that matches the specific horror of the snow cave and the school expedition, took place 4 years prior, involving the Oregon Episcopal School. This distinction is important because the lessons learned here were written in the margins of autopsy report. It was a tragedy born not out of malice, but out of a rigid adherence to a schedule and a fatal underestimation of the natural world. The Oregon Episcopal School, a prestigious private institution, had a unique requirement for its students. It was called the Base Camp Program. To graduate, sophomores were required to complete a wilderness experience designed to build character, teamwork, and resilience. The crown jewel of this program was the ascent of Mount Hood. It was a rite of passage. For months, the students trained. They conditioned their bodies and learned the basics of mountaineering. They were teenagers, 15 and 16 years old, full of the invincibility of youth. They trusted the adults leading them. They trusted the system. On Monday, May 12th, the group began their ascent. There were originally 20 people in the party. The team was led by the Reverend Thomas Goman, a faculty member who had climbed the mountain many times. He was a man of deep faith and determination, known for pushing students to exceed their perceived limits. Alongside him was Ralph Summers, a professional guide hired to provide technical expertise. They started their push for the summit at the lodge at 3 a.m. This is standard practice in mountaineering. You climb while the snow is frozen hard to avoid rockfall and post-holing, aiming to summit and descend before the afternoon sun softens the slopes. At 3 a.m., the sky was clear, the stars were bright, the air was crisp. It looked like the perfect day for a climb. But looking at the sky from the base of a mountain tells you very little about what is happening at 11,000 feet. The first cracks in the expedition appeared early. As the group ascended, several students began to struggle. They were suffering from altitude sickness, gastrointestinal issues, and sheer exhaustion. This is common with inexperienced climbers. At a designated rest point, a decision was made. One of the guides would take the struggling students back down to the lodge. 7 students and 1 guide turned around. That left 13 people on the mountain, 10 students, the teacher Thomas Goman, and the guide Ralph Summers. They pressed on, but they were moving slowly, much slower than the schedule demanded. In high-altitude climbing, speed is safety. The longer you are exposed, the higher the risk. By the time they reached the hogback, a ridge of snow leading to the final summit push, it was already afternoon. They were hours behind schedule. While they were struggling upward, the weather turned. A storm front that had been lurking off the coast slammed into the mountain with a violence that caught even the experienced guide off guard. The blue sky vanished, replaced by a wall of gray. The wind speed jumped from a breeze to a gale, gusting over 60 miles per hour. The temperature plummeted. The group was now in the death zone of the storm. They were just a few hundred feet from the summit when the whiteout hit. A whiteout is not just snow falling, it is a total erasure of the world. The sky and the ground merge into a single, featureless void. Vertigo sets in instantly. You cannot tell up from down. You cannot see the person tied to the rope 5 feet in front of you. Ralph Summers, the guide, realized the danger immediately. He recommended turning back, but the group was disjointed. Communication was difficult over the roar of the wind, and the decision to descend was delayed. By the time they turned around, their tracks, their only lifeline back to safety, had been scrubbed from the face of the earth by the wind. They tried to descend. They stumbled blindly down the slope, but the wind was disorienting them, pushing them sideways off course. They were drifting toward the zigzag glacier, a dangerous area full of crevasses and steep drop-offs. The physical toll on the students was catastrophic. They were wearing gear appropriate for a spring climb, not a full-blown Arctic blizzard. Hypothermia began to set in. Hypothermia is an insidious killer. It starts with shivering, which is the body's attempt to generate heat. But as the core temperature drops further, the shivering stops. The muscles stiffen. The brain begins to misfire. People become confused, lethargic. They stumble. They stop caring about their own survival. By late afternoon, it became clear they could not make it down. Several students were unable to walk. Darkness was approaching. To continue moving was a death sentence. They would walk off a cliff or freeze in their tracks. Ralph Summers and Godeman made the only decision left available to them. They had to dig in. They had to build a snow cave. This is where the true horror of the event begins to take shape. They were on a steep slope, battered by hurricane-force winds. They only had 3 shovels for 13 people. The students, already near collapse, had to use their hands and ice axes to claw at the frozen snow. They were digging a grave to save their lives. The cave they managed to excavate was not a spacious shelter. It was a hole, a burrow. It was roughly the size of a small bathroom, perhaps 4 or 5 feet high and roughly 6 feet wide. Into this tiny, damp, freezing void, 13 human beings were packed. They crawled in, one by one. The space was so tight that they couldn't sit side by side. They had to pile on top of one another. It was a mass of limbs and torsos, a tangle of ropes and wet gear. The guide, Ralph Summers, tried to organize them. He knew that body heat was their only fuel. He instructed them to huddle together. Once everyone was inside, they sealed the entrance. They used a tarp to cover the opening and piled snow on top of it to block the wind. This stopped the freezing gale from stripping away their remaining heat, but it created a new, silent enemy. A snow cave requires ventilation. You must have a hole to let carbon dioxide out and oxygen in. But the storm outside was raging with such ferocity that the snow piled up faster than they could clear it. The tarp was weighed down by heavy, wet snow. The seal became airtight. Inside the cave, the darkness was absolute. The noise of the storm was muffled, replaced by the sound of 13 people breathing. At first, the temperature rose. The collective body heat warmed the small space. For a brief moment, there might have been a sense of relief. They were out of the wind, but the air was running out. As the night wore on, the conditions inside the cave deteriorated into a nightmare. The space was too small. The students at the bottom of the pile were being crushed by the weight of those above them. The students at the top were pressed against the cold, dripping ceiling. Hypothermia does strange things to the mind. As the body shuts down, the brain enters a state of delirium. Some of the students began to hallucinate. There were reports of shouting, of confusion. But then a lethargy set in. This wasn't just the cold. It was the carbon dioxide building up. The oxygen levels dropped. The air grew stale and thick. Breathing became labored. Not that they would have noticed in their semi-conscious states. It is a quiet way to die. The urge to sleep becomes overpowering. The panic fades into a gray fuzz. By the morning of May 13th, the storm was still raging. Inside the cave, the situation was critical. Reverend Goman and several students were unresponsive. Ralph Summers knew that if they stayed in that hole, they would all die. He made a desperate choice. He would try to descend to get help. Summers took one of the students, Molly Shula, who was still mobile. They crawled out of the cave, into the blinding white. They marked the location of the cave as best they could, but in a whiteout, landmarks are non-existent. They stumbled down the mountain, fighting for every step. Back in the cave, 11 people remained. They were sealed in again. The tragedy of the Mount Hood disaster is not just in the death, but in the duration. The storm did not break for days. For 3 days, the mountain was locked in a violent temper tantrum. Rescue teams were assembled at the lodge, some of the best mountaineers in the world, but they were powerless. Helicopters were grounded. Foot teams were turned back by zero visibility and wind that could knock a man off his feet. Ralph Summers and Molly Shula miraculously made it down the mountain. They survived. They alerted the authorities that 11 people were still up there, buried in the snow, but they couldn't pinpoint the exact location. The mountain is vast, and the cave was just a small mound of snow in a field of white. On Wednesday, the weather finally broke. The clouds lifted. The sun struck the mountain, illuminating the fresh, deep snow. The rescue operation launched immediately. Hundreds of searchers probed the snow with long poles. They walked in grid lines, poking the ground, looking for a hollow space, looking for a body. It took hours. The searchers were exhausted, emotionally and physically. Then a probe struck something that didn't feel like rock or ice. It felt like fabric. They began to dig. What they found when they broke through the roof of the snow cave is an image that traumatized even the most hardened rescue workers. The 11 climbers were tangled together in a frozen mass. They were not moving. There was no sound. The heat that had initially saved them had melted the snow around them, which then refroze as their bodies cooled, essentially cementing them into the ice. They were pulled out one by one. They were clinically dead. No pulse, no breathing. Their bodies were stiff and cold as marble. In a normal situation, this is the end. But in cold water drowning and hypothermia cases, there is a medical saying, "You are not dead until you are warm and dead." The extreme cold had put their bodies into a state of suspended animation. Their metabolic rate had slowed to almost zero. The brain requires very little oxygen at that temperature. There was a sliver of the victims were loaded onto helicopters and flown to hospitals in Portland. Doctors prepared for a medical marathon. They used heart-lung bypass machines to warm the students' blood externally and pump it back into their bodies. It was a race to reheat them before cellular damage became irreversible. The families waited. The nation watched. It was a moment of collective holding of breath. Out of the 11 people pulled from that snow cave, only 2 survived. Brinton Clark and Giles Thompson. Their recovery was nothing short of miraculous, though it came at a cost. Giles Thompson required amputations due to the severe frostbite. The damage to their bodies was immense, but they were alive. The other 9, 7 students and the teacher, Thomas Goman, did not make it. The autopsies revealed the grim truth of their final hours. While hypothermia was the primary cause of death for some, the lack of oxygen played a massive role. They had suffocated in their shelter. The snow had sealed them in a tomb of their own making. The aftermath of the tragedy changed the way schools and organizations approach outdoor education. The base camp program was permanently altered. Questions were asked that are still difficult to answer today. Why didn't they turn back sooner? Why was the pressure to succeed allowed to override the instinct for survival? Why was a group of teenagers taken into a storm that professionals would have avoided? There is a lingering unease when you look at Mount Hood today. It is still beautiful. Climbers still flock there by the thousands. But for those who know the story, the mountain carries a different weight. When you are high up on the slope, near the hogback, and the wind dies down, there is a profound silence. It is easy to imagine the scene from 1986. The frantic digging, the huddled fear, the slow, quiet fade into sleep. The snow cave was meant to be a womb, a place of safety and protection. Instead, it became the exact opposite. It serves as a terrifying reminder that nature is indifferent to our schedules, our requirements, and our desperate need to survive. The mountain does not care if you are a student, a teacher, or a guide. If you stay too long, it simply claims you.